All right. Well, I have the good fortune today to speak with my friend Elaine Sexton, who uh, I before we started the podcast, I took a little stroll down memory lane in Oak Bluffs, Martha's Vineyard. But it's great to see you, Elaine. Yeah, the years have been much kinder to you than to me. But
Well,
it's
I don't
great to
know.
see you after a long time.
Thank you.
You are a noted poet, and I've been following your poetry for some time now, since I just happened upon it I'm not even sure how I happened upon it, but you're in the process of putting out a publishing a new book that comes out in May. It's called Site Specific. I find your titles for your books intriguing, and I'd like to
Oh,
explore
great.
that a little more as we go. But tell us a little bit about Site Specific.
Thank you. Thank you, Wayne. I'm so happy to reconnect with you after all these years. Um, so Site Specific is a book that's coming out in May. It's a new and selected. So a new and selected is kind of this is your life kind of thing. It's about 30 new poems, but it's this sort of a selection of my last four books. So about 20 to 30 poems from each of my previous books. So the title, thank you. I pride myself in my title, so thank you for pointing that out. So site specific is a term that is used um, in the art world for artwork that is responds directly to and takes place in a particular location. And I've been an art critic and writer for the last 20 years. And I really was drawn to this particular t title or term um, because I feel like poems are, um, I'm taking the term and making it my own by thinking of the site specific as the place in the imagination where poems are born or created. And I have a kind of hyper focus on objects and things. And so the things themselves are sites, the locations are sites. The experience of a poem is a kind of location. And ultimately, the poems themselves are sites, a place you go to have the experience of the poem. So that's
Do
yeah.
they, is it geographic sites or is can it be
In the art world, there's one of the most famous pieces is by Robert Smithson, where he created a spiral jetty in the
oh yeah, yeah,
Salt Lake, right?
yeah.
The Great Salt Lake, and it changes with the weather and the tides, and it's actually eroding as we speak. But anyway, that's a site-specific artwork. And so I've kind of appropriated that and kind of turned it on its side and um, thinking, making it, I don't know anyone who's applied it to poetry, but I think of that, um, you know, place, landscape, location's very important to me. And so I've kind of taken it,
So within site specific, the book,
right?
are you focused on a particular place, or is each poem site specific?
Each poem is site specific, but let me give you an example. I have a poem in the new part of the new portion of this book, the new poems, called Screen Door. And the screen door is, I guess one could call it a site. It's an object, but and I started thinking about that poem with this. The one thing that inspired me with that poem was the sound that a screen door makes when it slaps closed. And then I went in, as I was developing the poem, the splintered paint on a screen door. And so the experience of a screen door, which many of us have, if we're lucky enough to have a home that has a door that has a screen to it, uh, the bringing the screen door up from the basement in the spring to put it back on the door, there's a whole, you know, experience I have, but I like to think that my experience triggers other people's experiences. My documentation of that experience in the poem opens the door for people to have their own experience and remember their own experiences with screen
Yeah.
doors. But
Well,
also,
I loved that poem, and I'm going to ask you to read it later
oh, thank you.
because I only had to see the title to know that to hear the screen door bang.
Wow.
And
Oh,
yeah, I have one of those pesky screen doors on my little Sears and Roebuck bungalow here.
oh,
And
wow.
I
Nice.
keep saying I probably should replace it since it's the entrance to my studio, but I'm so fond of it.
No, 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 don't. They're all steel now. And so back, just staying on that for a moment. So, also it's a door, so there's the memory of this door, and then there's the object itself. It's a door, it closes, but it's a screen. So so the poem is about what it keeps out and what it lets in. So there's, hopefully layers to the experience of that. So,
Huh. Well, I know we're focusing on you, but I have to tell you a quick story that is site specific and it has something to do with the screen door at some point. But um, one of the things that I did back when I was in the Senate was to work with Donald Hall and Jane Kenyon,
oh, wow.
reserve a piece of land on Mount Kearsarge. So I got to be friends with them. And
Mhm.
Donald was talk about site specific, and even Jane was too a lot, but they were just extraordinary people. So I took a lot. I'm still a photographer, and I took a lot of images of not when they were alive, but after they died, because we're trying to preserve the homestead.
Oh, right.
And I have some really interesting stuff that I took in the house, that remind me of them. So, but I have to say, I've dabbled a little with poetry, but I think I'm like most people. I admire folks who can do it and do it well, who sort of carve meaning out of fewer and fewer words, and
Mm.
um, the I tend to be wordy, especially if I'm doing editorial writing.
I like, well, first of all, Jane Kenyon and Donald Hall are two amazing, incredible poets, New Hampshire poets, right? Well, became New Hampshire poets. Um, but I love the term you use, carved, because I feel like the poems are kind of sculpted things. They're
Hmm.
shaped things. So that's a
Yeah.
that's a good verb to
How
use.
did you always have an interest in poetry?
I did. My mother, well, I grew up in New Hampshire. I grew up in Rye Beach on the coast, that short coastline, small. And my mother used to play records of Robert Frost, another great
Oh
New
yeah.
Hampshire poet. And you know, I think that was my first, experience of poetry. And then I went to the University of New Hampshire, and one of the first reading I ever went to I think it was a freshman, Nikki Giovanni, who passed away this year. She was an African American poet. She was like 25 or 26. She was like a rock star poet. She was on Johnny Carson. Okay, so she she was amazing, and there was like 300 or 400 people in the audience, and she was this skinny, cute young woman. And I thought, and her poems were amazing. My House was the title of her first book. And I thought, oh, I could do that. I mean, and then of course it took me 20 years later to have for my first book. But um, yeah, so I just felt like poems encapsulated an experience and they just made something happen that no other art form did. And I practiced it for years and years before I really was able to make something of it.
You live your life that way? I mean, do you kind of live in stanzas, or I mean,
Oh, I love, well, the word stanza is from the Italian, which means room, right? Um, roughly translates to room. Uh, do I live in stanzas? I don't know. I feel like, I'm writing as I'm living. I feel like I'm always documenting things in words, putting things into words that I
So
experience.
oftentimes you'll go through the day and you'll just see something that catches your attention and that will take you off on a site-specific trip.
Yes, yes. Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I have a new poem. The very last poem I wrote and about 2 months ago was um, called Sleeve, and it's about that paper container thing that in a paper coffee cup, the
Right.
sleeve that you put over the coffee cup. And I had it in my hand, and I was thinking, how many trees died for for this thing that's kind of covering a thing that is holding a cup of coffee. And so the poem is really about, it's a conservation poem and ultimately a political poem about, how we live. But yeah, so that's an example of like holding this thing and thinking about where it came from and what it's doing.
How do the um, you mentioned political, so I'm not going to ask you necessarily about our current administration, but does your view of what life is like in the world at any given time affect the tenor of your poetry? Or is your poetry more of an escape from that?
Um, I feel like, quite a few of my more recent poems address decency and I feel like you can't get away from it's not an escape from, it's kind of a where, I think that's a interesting question to ask. I feel like, poems are where we dwell, and so where we are in our head, and it informs how we experience things. And from a very, very early age, my mother was a great appreciator of things. She grew up during the Depression and she saved everything, thread, buttons, little pieces of paper. And so, uh, an appreciation for things like that is in everything I write. I feel like even the economy of words, thrift. Uh, so, um, one's, political beliefs or, ethics, it enters into everything. Whether the poem is, on the surface about that or not, it's there.
Sure.
Values, I guess. Yeah.
Um, do, so you were writing even as a young girl, you were working on poetry, trying.
Yeah, I kept, of course, diaries and so two things, magazines and publishing and poetry are the core of my life. And when we met, as undergrads at the University of New Hampshire, I started my first magazine, which was in the communications department, and I think we were connected because I found this journal, this magazine that we started and published many of your poems and many of your photographs. You were a
Oh,
photographer,
yeah.
and um, so um, so even as a child, I had a pen pal that I would make little mock newspapers and send them is my version of a letter to my friend who lived in Maryland. And so I think started writing poems in high school and college, and but my career was in magazine publishing. That's what I did to make a living. So I think writing and making books has always been,
Uh,
you
I
know,
think I remember that journal magazine that we published together.
it
But
was,
do you
yeah.
remember what the name of it was?
Yes, oh, it was a funny name. Serendipity.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
And
I think I have that in the trunk somewhere. I'll have to
yeah.
go down to my basement.
Well, your photographs were beautiful. I remember that.
Yeah.
And anyway, so my career, my publishing career was in magazine development. So I started working on magazines from the scratch, like starting
Where
them.
did you do that? Tell us a little bit about that.
In New York, I moved to New York, and after college, and it's so hard to get a job. The only job, my first job was with a group of people that were starting a magazine called Guitar World.
Oh, I remember
I knew
that.
nothing about guitars, but I that they were looking for someone to sell advertising, and anyway, I jumped in, started working on that, worked my way up to, advertising director, and then I started a photography magazine for them, outdoor and travel photography that was about 10 years, lived about
Wow.
10 years. So I worked my way up to the top. So then I had more creative control over the magazines. So I went from photography to quilting. These were special interest magazines, quilting, decorating, um, you name it. We did a magazine for it. So
Wow.
yeah,
And
that.
that's so that was, did you know that's kind of where you were going to land when you left college?
No, no, I wanted to be a writer. I think I would have preferred to be, a writer or work on the editorial side of things, but that this was the opportunity I had. And I made a really good living at it. And it wasn't until I was, in my late 30s, early 40s that I was always writing on the side, and uh, on the side is the main term there.
Hmm.
And during the late 80, or early 90s, I have to say, when I had a number of friends who died of AIDS, I had this kind of moment. Well, it's a long story. I won't go into that part, specifically what happened, but I just thought, you know, I'm not dead yet, but I could be. I'm not going to wait till retirement to really focus on poetry and write what I really want to do. So I went back to graduate school, and at Sarah Lawrence, and I worked full time and went back to graduate school and did that in 3 years instead of two. And my first book came out 2 years after I graduated. But I was 10 and sometimes 20 years older than my fellow classmates, but that was like life altering. Um,
What was the name of your first book?
Sleuth,
Sleuth.
right? And Sleuth, it takes its title from a reading of Nancy Drew books. Um, I learned to read really, or love to read when my older I have a sister who's 8 years older than I am, and she went to Georgetown, and when she came home her freshman year, I was 8, she was 18, or roughly uh, 18, 8. Um, and her college roommate gave her entire collection of Nancy Drew books, which are kind of antique now. And I just like read through them. I just like devoured them. And I just loved to read. And so this Nancy Drew character whose father was a widower, and my father died when I was young, so my mother was a widow. I really identified with um, Nancy as a private investigator. And I got this idea that a poet was kind of an investigator as well. So I really kind of examined poems as for the evidence that they uh, expose about life. So anyway, that's a long answer to your
Oh
question.
no, that's a wonderful answer. Is there a poem in that book that sort of is the paradigm of the way you were thinking?
Yes, well, there's a long poem called Sleuth, but the first poem in that book is called Crime Scene. I'd be happy to read it if you want.
Yeah, sure. Can you?
Yeah, yeah. Um, and this crime scene is one of the first significant poems that were published in a significant place, American Poetry Review. And it was the first poem that I actually got a fan letter from someone. I can tell you that does
That's
not happen.
always exciting, isn't it?
I know. The editor David Bonanno at American Poetry Review forwarded it to me, and it was like, oh my God, someone out there has read this poem. Okay, here we go. I don't think it needs any on-ramp. I went to school. I went to a Catholic school on an island off the coast of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Okay, crime scene. Nothing actual happened in the schoolhouse girls' room on the island. It just looked like something could. The scrubbed green and black linoleum floors stretched under tubs and toilets made of porcelain and closed up in oak stalls. A mop and bucket in the corner might have been used to disturb evidence. By mid-morning, a weak light pressed through Coke glass windows near the ceiling. Made in America stained the bottom of spotless white basins I examined in my hour of exile from lessons. This is where I know the Sisters of Mercy bathed naked on their summer retreats and later sent their failures, like me, to think about sin without instruction. I sat on the rim of a white tub and tried to make the connection between evil and not remembering how to spell. I gave up and resolved to be like Houdini, to practice the trade of escape. This I would learn to do with finesse, to be present but gone. The refinement came later. But now, when the hall bell rang, my episode ended. Recess brought dozens of girls dressed like me swarming in. I flung my cell door open and joined the flood of others in a rush of pushing and flushing. I was spinning in place, not knowing exactly what to do. When no one was watching, I forgot, and the forgetting eventually became me.
Wow. To be present but gone. That I, what's that? Three words? That, and
Mm,
yet it. I think a lot of people would relate to it.
mm,
Um,
mm,
but you again, you carved it out for
yeah.
this poem, and that's a very no wonder you got a fan
Thank you. You're a really good listener. I have to read the poem on the page. It's hard for me to catch phrases and hold on to them if I'm just,
letter. I'm kind of an oral learner.
oh, wow. Well, obviously, I'm a visual learner. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
But it's not. I complain about not selling enough of my artwork. Don't complain publicly about it, but I complain privately to my dog Cody about it. But at least I have something that's reasonably easy to sell. A
Mhm.
poet is in a completely different position because, first of all, there may be less of an appreciation for the words on a page. Um, they can buy it when it comes out in a book, but you don't generally sell individual poems, do you?
No, right.
So has that been a difficult transition for you to move from having a well-paying job in publishing to writing poems that somehow generate enough of an income for you that you can survive?
Yeah. Well, nobody's in poetry for the money. I'll tell you that. Um, uh, I was, I have another poem I think I sent you when you asked to see some poems called Rethinking Regret. Um, and You know, I'm lucky that I feel fortunate that I did make good money for a number of years, and so I don't have to rely on poetry now at this point in my life as for an income. So there's virtually no money in poetry. Um, Unless you sell thousands of copies. I mean, if you win a Pulitzer Prize and you're maybe Billy Collins, maybe, or Mary Oliver, to name the best-selling poet
Yes,
in
right.
America.
Right.
I mean, they do make a living on the books, but really on readings and events and, public. public appearances is where poets make a living,
Hmm.
some kind of living, or teaching. But, I started too late to really go down that road of having an academic career. So
But
I
you do readings and
oh yeah, yes, I do. But what I'm saying is, anyway, I'm not hawking individual poems. I do,
right,
I do want to sell books, and that's important. But it's not really, the residuals for poetry are, not what they are for a novel, let's say.
right, right. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I'm fortunate that I don't have to, I do teach, but I don't have. It's not my, fundamental primary source of income.
Yes, I noticed that you teach at Sarah Lawrence. Is that
Mhm.
right?
Once, yes.
And what do you teach there?
I teach poetry. I'm an adjunct. I teach one class a semester.
Hmm.
Um, and I also have a private practice of teaching. I really love teaching. I wish I had started out doing that because I really enjoy it. Um, and it keeps me, deeply engaged in contemporary poetry. And so, yeah.
That's interesting. I'm not sure how to ask this question, but um, I find that uh, that the sort of whatever the current uh, whims and rhythm of the era are, they dramatically affect the way students respond to both my own work as well as to things that we read. I mean, it
Mm.
the I think a lot of teachers these days, particularly college professors of some sort, are finding it very difficult to navigate the waters of uh, people who consider um, an an honest dialogue an attack on them or an attack on someone else, and
Mm.
so that there's been, but I don't think I can't see that that would affect poetry, but maybe it does.
Oh yeah, well I'm sure it does. Well, so I teach adults. So I teach at the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence. So it's different than 18-year-olds or young people who come to, you know, they don't have the life experience of
Mhm.
adults who have other careers, doctors and dentists and lawyers who are taking poetry workshops later in life. Um, so yeah, well yeah. I'm not sure how to answer that
No,
question.
it wasn't well phrased.
No. I mean, I know what you mean, and I feel like, you know, if you teach, I teach craft, and I teach, how to make poems and that kind of structure, and and a, a wide cross section of contemporary and classic poetry. So I think if you start with how to make a thing, then people can bring their own backgrounds and beliefs
Yeah,
and experiences into the.
right. Well, that's interesting. If you a lot, those of us who have just dabbled at poetry, uh, uh, we're it's probably pretty free form when you get right down to it because we don't know what the hell we're doing.
Uh-huh.
And so if I wanted to learn more about the structure of poetry, what would you recommend that I read?
Hmm. Well, it's so interesting. When I was starting out to be focused more seriously on poetry, I bought books like on craft that I thought, like Mary Oliver back, 30 years ago had several books about craft. And
Oh,
it wasn't, and I read them and I was like, I wasn't computing, it wasn't sinking in really until later. And when I go back and sometimes use it for teaching, I see what she was doing. But I feel like as a practitioner, you can appreciate what she was saying about how poems are made. But I feel like the best teacher is reading deeply, reading. poetry that you love deeply and seeing how it's made. And the way I teach is I kind of we do that. We do a deep reading of poems, different types of poems, and learn what the structure they're built on structure. So they may seem free form, but there's a structure, there's a core to the poem. So if it's not written in actual form, like a sonnet or a pantoum or a sestina, there's a structure which could be the idea. The idea itself could be the structure that you're building on. So as I mentioned, the screen door, the structure is the screen and all the sensations that screens, um, my experience of screens, doors have. But that is in fact a structure. It may look like it's not shaped, but it's shaped around an idea.
Oh,
Others are shaped around sounds, repetition, um, parallelism, like Walt Whitman, one thing compared next to another. So those are kind of structures that once you start paying attention to them and reading them and absorbing them, then you can, when you sit down to write, maybe something will sink in.
so do you use a book on structure in your class, or is it just
I
a
I don't, I've read a lot. I love reading about process and how other poets make their poems. Um, but by now I know enough to kind of bring the elements of structures to the class and get student writers to look at poems in that way. So,
yeah,
I mean, it's sort of like painting or photography, right? You look at a photograph and that decisive moment where you have an image, that's kind of, you sort of learn that or train yourself to see that. Some of it is innate, but others is you look at work you love and how did they do that? And what were they, how did they, how did they put themselves in the position to take that picture, right?
yeah,
So I think poetry is quite like that.
yeah. Cartier-Bresson, the decisive moment. Yep.
There we go. Exactly. Yeah.
Um, I wrote about that on my Substack a few months ago, and that's been really interesting to. I got a lot of response from people about it, but most of the time they said, and this is not really like yours because you tend to decide that you want to do all kinds of weird stuff to your photographs.
Yeah. Manipulate the image. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
But every once in a while you capture exactly what you want and put it into the structure that you want or have the structure molded around that. That's what you're
Yeah. Well, you modify the image to make it that moment happen, right? Something
yeah,
happens while you're altering the photograph, right?
right. So
Yes.
so you have 5 books currently,
This will be my fifth. Yes.
and they're all still available.
Yes, they are. And that's, part of the new and selected. I think originally when people started doing book called new and selected, was when earlier books may or may not be out of print. So my first two books came out with a wonderful publisher called New Issues, that has really just shuttered last year. So those books, they're still in circulation, but um, kind of the need to be sure that those poems are still in print is ensured by having this new and selected.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, yeah. So they're all still still available. I mean, my first book came out in 2003, so they're not ancient, but we go back 2 decades.
But the poems that you've told me about, each one of them was something that caught my eye as I was reading through your poetry. And so
Thank you.
maybe you do the screen door for us.
Oh, sure, I'd love to. And this is the first interview I've done for this book because I don't even have a hard copy. I don't even have a galley in hand, but I have a printed page here. Screen door. I can't stop hearing and touching. It's splintering and yawning. It's mothering. It's calling. It's bang and air moving through its face. It's trim, never quite lining up. It's wood. It's warp. It's hook and eye. It's New Hampshire. It's beach and flies caught in it. It's passage. It's callback. It's self-slamming shut. It's banging and it's spring. It's longing to be pressed. It's screws coming loose. It's green paint peeling. Summer cottage hush. It's winters in the basement. It's basement. It's coming up for air. It's Robert Frost. It's Wallace Stevens. It's William Carlos Williams. It's weeping, its mind never satisfied, its roads diverging in a wood, its spine, its sunshine of late afternoon. It's doing what it says it's going to do, the way it paints its own way, its draw, its draft, its closing and not closing, its back door, its back to everything overgrown grass on the other side of its wrist, its small knob, its metal, its morning. It's very early morning. It's always very early morning.
Beautiful. It is so evocative for me, and I'm sure that it is for other people who listen to it. I think of a day that I was out photographing in the late fall, and by that time all the leaves were pretty much gone except on the tamarack, which is a
Oh,
bright yellow in the fall, and it loses its needles
mm,
much later. So it makes for some very interesting things. And I happened to be on the road where Robert Frost had lived.
wow.
So it was sort of an extraordinary experience to walk along there and think about him doing the same thing,
Mm.
greeting his neighbors and then seeing these tamarack in the grove. And what do you do something special for inspiration, or do you just take your inspiration from everyday life?
Well, both things. I really am devoted to visual art. If I, no matter what, if I walk into a gallery or a museum, I come out changed. It's a great experience. So a lot of the work in the new, well, in each of my books, there's work that responds to a work of art, visual art, but probably more so in the most in this current book collection. Um, but so yeah, so but yeah, so I don't know. I find inspiration from just reading interviews and reviews and I read with a pencil. I've taught a course called Reading with a Pencil where you circle words like just
Yeah,
one word, deciduous, I don't know. Uh that can just
right.
get you on a spin. So you have to be ready for those words or phrases or something you've overheard or, you know, something that sticks out that doesn't belong.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I write in my books too. I know
I
it's
know.
if you're the writer of the book, you probably don't approve, but
Well,
uh
you have to know to go back to things, right? Otherwise, it's just lost and yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, I would love to have you read the regret,
Rethinking regret. I would
rethinking
be
regret,
happy
but you have to promise to leave us on a lighter note at the end.
to. All right. Do I have a happy? Oh, I gave a reading one time. I thought, I was like looking for an uplifting poem, but anyway. All right. Well, I think rethinking regret is very uplifting.
Okay, all
I
right.
I think so because I
Let's
think,
try it out.
yeah. All right. Thank you, Wayne, for inviting me to do this. Rethinking regret. Let's thank our mistakes. Let's bless them for their humanity, their terribly weak chins. We should offer them our gratitude and admiration for giving us our clefts and scarring us with embarrassment, the hot flash of confession. Thank you, transgressions, for making us so right in our imperfections. Less flawed, we might have turned away, feeling too fit, our desires looking for better directions. Without them, we might have passed the place where one of us stood watching someone else walk away and followed them, while our perfect mistake walked straight towards us, walked right into our cluttered, ordered lives that could have been closed but were not, that could have been asleep, but instead stayed up all night, forgetting the pill, the good book, the necessary 8 hours, and lay there in the middle of the bed, keeping the heart awake, open and stunned. Stunning. How unhappy perfection must be over there on the shelf without a crack, without this critical break, this falling, this sudden, thrilling draft.
How unhappy perfection might be. That is uplifting. You really you capture the what every good teacher and preacher tries to tell us, and that is learn from your mistakes, embrace them, uh, let them take you higher.
Mm, mm. Yes, yes. If you love yourself, you have to, all these things brought us to who we are now, right? Our mistakes and
That's right.
everything,
Yeah.
flaws and all, right?
All right.
So, yeah.
Elaine Sexton, it has been a joy
Oh,
to
Wayne,
talk
thank
with
you so much.
you. I hope we get a chance to talk again. Maybe after the book comes out, we can do a few more poems.
I would love to do it. Thank you so much.
All right.
All right.
Good to see you, my friend.
You too.
Take
Bye.
care.